world had never seen anything like this, what appeared to be the aftermath of a natural disaster. But it was not. It was something far darker, more deliberate. An army, an entire force, swallowed whole by the very land they sought to conquer. The relentless, unstoppable tide of nature itself had turned into a weapon. The fate of thousands of soldiers, their supply lines, and their entire mission hung in the balance, trapped in a web of mud and water. In the northeastern reaches of a war-torn country, a vital artery pulsed through the heart of the Russian offensive. The Severki Donets River, its bridges and crossing points, were the lifeline of their military campaign. For months, this river had carried the weight of soldiers, tanks, and the supplies needed to fuel the operation. Without it, their progress would grind to a halt. No resupply, no reinforcements, nothing to continue their push toward the strategic objective of Vovchansk. It was the unspoken truth of modern warfare. Logistics are the true drivers of victory. The bridges that spanned the Severki Donets were not just steel and concrete, they were the very veins of the operation. Thousands of tons of equipment, ammunition, and troops flowed across them daily. If they were severed, it could be the end. The heart of the Russian advance would stop beating, and their entire northern campaign in Kharkiv Oblast would crumble. And on October 25th, something unexpected began to unfold. At first, it seemed like a minor disruption.
We're not gonna make it.
The first signs were subtle, a few reports, vague enough to dismiss, that indicated something was amiss in the area. But by the next day, the situation began to take shape. The lifeline that the Russian military had come to rely on was slipping from their grasp, not in the form of an assault or an attack, but by something far more insidious. It wasn't a bullet or a missile that struck, but a force much more ancient, more uncontrollable. The power of nature itself was being weaponized. Ukraine had chosen a different path, one that seemed almost too simple to be real. Rather than attacking the well-protected crossing points directly, where the Russians had fortified their positions for months, Ukraine had focused on the Belgod Reservoir Dam miles away from the front lines. It was a brilliant, daring plan, one that transformed nature's power into a weapon capable of shutting down the entire Russian advance. A strike that, once initiated, could not be undone. This was no ordinary military operation. It was a masterpiece of strategy, an asymmetric attack designed to disrupt a crucial supply route in a way that no one had anticipated. The Belgod Dam was not just an infrastructure project, it was the key to controlling the flow of water through the Severki Donets River, and by targeting it, Ukraine sought to cut the very lifeblood of Russia's war effort. In the early hours of October 25th, the first blow was struck. Small, calculated strikes hit the dam structure, testing its limits. A few cracks, a few leaks, nothing catastrophic, but enough to send ripples through the command center. Russia, focused on securing the river crossings and advancing their front, didn't see it coming. But by the afternoon of October 26th, everything had changed. The dam had been damaged seriously. The breaches, now widened by additional attacks, allowed the water behind it to begin its descent. A violent rush of water surged through the riverbed, creating a torrent that would sweep away everything in its path. The Russian positions, once strategically placed along the banks, began to disappear into the flood. Bridges that were once strong and reliable were now submerged, washed away by the unrelenting force of the river. Thousands of soldiers, heavy artillery, and vehicles were trapped. Their primary supply route had been severed, their advance halted. They were cut off from resupply, unable to move forward or back. What had once been a lifeline had turned into a deadly trap. This was no longer a matter of military strategy, it was a race for survival. The floodwaters had turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and chaos, and there was nowhere to run. But this was no accident. Ukraine had orchestrated this operation with a precision that could only come from the most meticulous planning. It was a two-day campaign that unfolded like a perfect storm. The initial attacks had tested the dam's structural integrity, causing just enough damage to begin a chain reaction. Then, the final blow came a devastating assault that caused the breach, unleashing the floodwaters in full force. The Russian forces, caught in the middle, were left helpless. Soldiers who had once charged across these same bridges now found themselves trapped in a flood of their own making, their supplies washed away, and their mission at risk. The forward momentum that had been so carefully built was now slipping away, dragged into the depths of the Severky Donets. The dream of advancing toward Vovchansk was fading as quickly as the water swirled around them. This was the moment that would change everything. A carefully calculated disruption, hidden behind the cloak of nature itself, had reshaped the battlefield. Ukraine, with this single brilliant stroke, had not only halted the Russian advance, but had exposed the vulnerabilities of the most powerful military force in the region. And now, the floodwaters were rising not just through the river, but through the heart of the Russian war machine. The lifeline was gone, and with it, the hope of continuing the march toward victory. The floodgates had opened, but it wasn't just water that rushed forth. It was a disaster, a storm unleashed by the power of nature itself. The Belgod Reservoir Dam, once a quiet guardian of the region's flow, had been breached. What had begun as a small crack quickly grew into an uncontrollable torrent, sending waves of destruction down the Severky Donets River and washing away everything in its path. This wasn't a natural disaster, it was a carefully calculated weapon, wielded by Ukraine, with a precision that left even the most hardened military minds stunned. For the Russian forces, it was as if the ground beneath them had suddenly shifted. In an instant, the lifeline that supported their entire military operation had been severed, and with it, their entire plan.
Hold on to the netting!
What had once been a carefully orchestrated advance was now nothing more than a sinking ship, trapped in an unyielding flood.
We must
the river's
secure the
normal
dam at all
flow was
costs.
shattered,
The flooding is
disrupted
unacceptable.
beyond recognition,
We push through here.
and the ensuing chaos spread like wildfire. The battlefront had turned into a nightmare. The breach in the dam wasn't just a simple crack. It was the beginning of something much larger, something impossible to control. The initial attack on October 25th had been a calculated test, probing the dam's defenses, pushing them just enough to see if it could withstand the pressure. The water level behind the dam had begun to drop, but it wasn't until the second wave of strikes fiercer, more relentless, that the true power of nature was unlocked. With that second wave, the dam's integrity shattered. The water surged, pouring into the riverbed in an unstoppable, furious flow. It wasn't just a flood, it was a tidal wave of military might, and its target was the Russian supply route, the very heart of their operation. Soldiers, equipment, and vehicles that depended on this crossing point were now helpless. They were trapped, unable to advance or retreat, as the floodwaters surged across their positions. The land that had once been their advantage now betrayed them. The river, a once friendly ally, had turned into an enemy. The flow of water was not just a logistical setback, it was a death sentence. In those chaotic hours, the severing of supply lines was felt almost immediately. With the river rising rapidly, the main bridge and crossing points, crucial to Russian operations, were overwhelmed. Reports poured in from the front. Soldiers stranded, unable to communicate, unable to move. Heavy machinery, once a symbol of Russian strength, was now powerless, stuck in the thick mud that had swallowed the land. The equipment tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles became nothing more than abandoned shells. The logistics chain was severed. Ammunition couldn't reach the soldiers. Food and water were no longer flowing. Medical supplies, already in short supply, were rendered useless. The worst part? There was no way to fix it. The bridge, the very spine of their advance, was gone. The flood had turned it to rubble, and in its wake, it left Russian forces stranded, helpless, cut off from everything they had once relied upon. The path forward was impassable, and retreat was equally impossible. Thousands of soldiers, caught in the middle, could do nothing but wait as the waters rose. In the chaos, there was no distinction between the enemy and nature itself. The flood wasn't just a barrier, it was a weapon. It didn't need guns or bombs to inflict its damage. The river's surge tore apart months of careful planning, unraveling the Russian forces' supply lines faster than any missile could. A logistical death sentence had been delivered not by man, but by nature itself. The river's overflow wasn't just a strategic disaster, it was the very embodiment of a perfect trap, set by an enemy who understood that sometimes the best weapon is the one you don't even need to fire. What had started as a test of the dam's defenses had become an unstoppable force, altering the course of the conflict in a matter of hours. The consequences of that breach were not just immediate, they would echo for days, weeks, and potentially longer. The flow of water wasn't the only thing that surged forward. So did the fear and uncertainty within the Russian
Belgod Dam is
ranks.
paramount
With
for
the
the
flood
revised
came a
strategy in
growing
the Oblast.
realization that their plans had crumbled, not in the face of direct combat, but due to an unforeseen, devastating turn of events. They were caught in a trap they couldn't escape. And just like that, Ukraine's brilliant maneuver, an operation so simple in its execution but so devastating in its outcome, had thrown the Russian military into disarray. The river, once a simple geographic feature, had become an unyielding adversary, and in the wake of this chaos, the soldiers who had once marched confidently towards Vovchansk now found themselves struggling to stay afloat, both literally and figuratively, as the floodwaters continued to rise. The dam had been breached, but the true extent of the damage had only begun to reveal itself. What seemed like an isolated incident, a series of attacks on a dam far from the front lines, had turned into a strategic masterpiece, executed with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Ukraine had set a trap, and it was unfolding perfectly. The floodwaters now surged uncontrollably, but it was the timing, the meticulous planning, and the execution that turned this simple act into a devastating blow to the Russian war machine. It was the evening of October 26th when the operation reached its critical moment. The first wave of strikes had been enough to create cracks in the dam, a test of the structure's vulnerability, but that was only the beginning. Ukraine knew the dam would not collapse immediately. This had been calculated. The first wave wasn't meant to destroy. It was designed to weaken, to create a window of opportunity, and it worked. With the first cracks in place, the second wave of attacks followed. The operation was not rushed. Every movement had been planned, every detail accounted for. This wasn't just military strategy. This was the art of war, a lesson in precision, patience, and timing. The second strike came like a storm, a precise, relentless assault, using kamikaze drones, sleek, swift, and deadly. These drones had been used before, and their devastating power was well known. But this time, they weren't targeting tanks or artillery, they were targeting a dam. The force of the attack caused serious damage. It was no longer a simple breach. The dam's integrity was shattered. The water behind it, once contained, was now a force unleashed, rushing out with a speed and power that was impossible to stop. The damage was catastrophic. The water level behind the dam dropped more than a meter, and with it, the Russian forces' hold on the region began to slip away. What was once a controlled flood, manageable and predictable, had transformed into a violent, uncontrollable force. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of the very infrastructure that supported the Russian offensive. The river, once a strategic asset, now became the very thing that destroyed their supply line. The dam had been weakened. The water, once contained behind its concrete walls, was now spilling over, flooding everything in its path. The flow of water was no longer a slow trickle, it was a torrent, and with it, the Russian army's forward momentum was halted. The crossing points, essential to resupply and reinforce troops at the front, were submerged. The bridges, the very lifelines of their advance, were now unreachable. The forces that had once confidently marched toward Vovchansk now found themselves stuck, cut off from everything they needed. They were stranded, isolated, and helpless. This wasn't a simple attack on an infrastructure. It was a decimation of the Russian military's ability to function. The floodwaters that surged across the river were more than just water. They were a symbol of the strategic brilliance of Ukraine's attack. It wasn't brute force that had stopped Russia's advance. It was an understanding of the land, of nature, and of how to turn its power into a weapon. Ukraine had outplayed their enemy at every turn, using the very environment to dismantle the Russian war effort. What had started as an isolated, perhaps even underestimated strike, had turned into a strategic game-changer. The Russian military was now in disarray. Their supply lines were cut off. Heavy equipment that depended on the supply route was stuck, unable to move. Their tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles were buried in thick mud, unable to advance or retreat. The logistical nightmare was in full swing, and there was no escape. Thousands of Russian soldiers, once part of a powerful offensive, now found themselves trapped by the flood. In the chaos, the beauty of the operation was in its simplicity. The dam wasn't destroyed in one grand explosion. It was broken slowly, methodically, allowing the forces behind the attack to control the flow of events. Ukraine had not just struck with force, they had struck with foresight. They had understood that the true weapon was not in the missile or the bomb, but in the patience to wait, to strike at just the right moment, and to use nature's fury as the ultimate weapon. The Russian forces, now cut off, could only watch as the floodwaters took their supplies, their weapons, and their hope. The battlefield had shifted, but not because of direct combat. It had shifted because of the calculated use of the environment, a lesson in how a brilliant, asymmetric strategy could turn the tide of war without ever firing a shot. What Ukraine had done was more than just attack. It was the perfect trap, and Russia had walked straight into it. In a single moment, the heart of Russia's military operation had been severed. With it, their forward momentum was lost. The dam had been breached, the floodwaters had surged, and the critical supply route, the very lifeline that had kept their forces moving, was now a ruin. This wasn't just a logistical disruption, it was a catastrophe, a devastating blow that shattered everything the Russian military had worked toward. The floodwaters didn't just wash away equipment, they drowned the future of the Russian advance. Bridges, once sturdy and dependable, were now underwater. The roads, once packed with the heavy tread of tanks and trucks, had become impassable, turned to mud and mire by the unrelenting water. Supply lines, the bloodline of any military operation, had been severed with surgical precision. With every passing hour, the realization grew clearer. There would be no reinforcements, no supplies, no way to continue the advance. The Russian forces, unable to move forward or retreat, were trapped in a deadly standstill. The flood wasn't just a military challenge, it was a suffocating reality. Soldiers found themselves trapped, surrounded by the rising waters, unable to communicate with command. The machines they depended on, the vehicles that had once moved with purpose, now sat immobilized, helpless against the water's grip. The weight of their own isolation began to sink in as the floodwaters continued to rise. What had been a powerful force pushing forward now found itself drowning in the mud and water it once thought it controlled. What had once been a strategic military zone was now an environmental battlefield, where the river was both the enemy and the weapon. The situation was untenable. Thousands of soldiers, who had once relied on the bridges and crossing points to resupply and regroup, now faced an impossible choice: to wait, to fight, or to drown. The river, once a crucial asset in their advance, had become their tomb. But it wasn't just the Russian military that had been affected. The flood also swept into civilian territories, leaving entire communities at risk. Settlements that had once been safe behind the front lines were now submerged, caught in the flood's wake. The local populations, already suffering from the effects of war, now found themselves faced with the growing threat of drowning. Families were forced to evacuate, leaving behind everything they had known. The civilian toll was growing, and as the floodwaters rose, so too did the sense of helplessness in the region. The impact of the dam's destruction wasn't just felt in the flooded streets, it rippled through the Russian command structure, shaking the very foundations of their strategy. What had begun as a military operation had turned into a logistical nightmare, and no amount of force could undo the damage. The floodwaters had broken the Russian advance, but they had also broken something deeper, the illusion of invincibility. Russia, a force that had believed it could march unchecked across the region, had been humbled by nature itself. With the main supply routes washed away, the Russian military faced a dilemma. They were stranded. The equipment they relied on was useless. The soldiers they depended on were disoriented, and their strategic objectives were slipping further from reach. The bridges, the roads, and the infrastructure that had supported their offensive were gone, swallowed by the flood. The sheer weight of the situation, the isolation, and the inability to act created an environment where every minute that passed deepened the crisis. The Russian forces weren't just facing a military setback, they were trapped in a disaster they couldn't control. The brilliance of Ukraine's strategy had been in its simplicity. They hadn't needed to launch a full-scale assault. Instead, they had struck at the heart of Russia's logistical framework, disrupting their ability to resupply and reinforce. The flood didn't just isolate the Russian military, it decimated their ability to act. What had seemed like a momentary disruption had become a game-changing blow,
The flood zones
one that
have
forced
successfully
Russia to
isolated
confront
the eastern
not
route.
just the power
Confirmed.
of Ukraine's
Enemy
military,
markers are
but
going
the
dark
limits of
across
their
the
own
basin.
strategy. And as the floodwaters continued to rise, the Russian forces found themselves sinking not just in mud and water, but in a growing realization that their march forward had been stopped not by bullets or bombs, but by the unpredictable power of nature. The battlefield had shifted, not through direct confrontation, but through the controlled use of an environmental weapon that turned the tide of war. The storm had come not from the sky, but from the very ground beneath their feet, and in that moment, the Russian military had learned the harshest of lessons, that even the mightiest can be drowned by the tide they once thought they controlled. As the floodwaters continued to surge, they didn't just wash away military equipment, they carried with them the lives of countless civilians who had nowhere to go, no safety to seek. It was the cruelest of ironies. Those who had already been living on the edge of survival, in the shadow of war, now found themselves drowning in the very flood that had crippled the Russian military. The humanitarian disaster unfolding was as profound as the military catastrophe that had already taken root. At least 10 villages in the Shebkino district of Russia had been submerged. Entire communities were lost in the flood's wake. The people who had once lived in relative peace, caught between the ravages of war and the ever-present threat of violence, now faced a new terror. Evacuation orders were issued, but there was no guarantee that anyone would be able to escape the flood's grip. For the civilians living in these border settlements, the war had already taken so much, and now it was threatening to take everything. The flood didn't discriminate. It didn't care whether you were a soldier or a civilian, a general or a farmer. Everyone in its path was swept away, leaving only a wake of destruction in its trail. The roads that had once been safe, the bridges that had supported lives, were now impassable. Power stations, water systems, and food supplies all were either damaged or destroyed. The floodwaters didn't just disrupt military strategy. They had decimated the lifeline of an entire population. For those left behind, the situation became one of pure survival. The evacuation efforts, though well-intended, were chaotic. Governor Vasily Gladov of Belgod region had to confront the dire reality head-on. Forced to advise residents in villages like Bezlovka and Vartavlyanka to evacuate, he realized that the flood was more than just a military problem, it was a crisis that would break the spirit of the people. The same residents who had already been weathering constant power cuts, missile strikes, and ongoing conflict were now dealing with something far worse. The threat of losing everything to the rising waters. The sense of helplessness was palpable. As families scrambled to escape, the Russian authorities' inability to provide any meaningful protection became painfully clear. What had begun as a well-orchestrated military operation had now spiraled into a full-fledged humanitarian disaster. The citizens who had once trusted their government to protect them now faced the painful reality that they were left to fend for themselves. The flood wasn't just an enemy, it was a force of nature that exposed the government's vulnerabilities. What had been a localized conflict had now spread like wildfire. The ripple effect was undeniable. Power outages, already a common occurrence due to the ongoing war, intensified. Energy infrastructure had been destroyed, and with winter approaching, the cold was only going to make things worse. What was once a discomfort had turned into a life-threatening situation. The people of Belgod, who had already been pushed to the brink, now had to contend with freezing temperatures, the loss of their homes, and the very real fear of being swept away by the flood. In this moment of crisis, the local population found themselves caught in the crossfire of war and nature. As the floodwaters rose, so did the tension. People who had once lived relatively peaceful lives now found themselves on the edge, their lives hanging in the balance. The river had not only cut off Russia's military supply lines, it had exposed the cracks in the government's ability to protect its own people. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, there was a quiet resistance in the air. Families fought to stay together, to survive, to endure the impossible. They navigated through the water, carried their children to higher ground, and tried to salvage whatever they could. This was a fight for survival, a fight against the flood, the enemy, and the despair that threatened to overtake them. The flood might have broken their homes, their infrastructure, their livelihoods, but it had not broken their spirit. But for the authorities, the flood had revealed something far darker. The chaos was impossible to ignore. The media coverage, the reports of people trapped, of entire communities submerged, began to flood the news. It wasn't just military strategy that was falling apart, it was the very fabric of the government's control. The public's trust in their leadership was beginning to unravel. The Kremlin, which had once presented an image of invulnerability, now found itself exposed. What had begun as an isolated crisis had become a national humiliation. As the flood continued to wreak havoc, it wasn't just the floodwaters that were rising, it was the anger, the fear, and the growing unrest. The people of Belgod and other affected regions were starting to realize that their government was either unwilling or incapable of protecting them. The flood had not only devastated the land, it had devastated the Russian government's image, exposing its fragility, its inability to manage a crisis of this magnitude. In the coming days, the true cost of the flood would be measured not just in lives lost, but in the loss of faith in the government, in the deepening divide between the people and their leaders. The flood had not only isolated the Russian military, it had isolated an entire population, left them stranded, and forced them to face the harsh truth. In the face of nature's fury, the power of the state seemed to crumble, leaving only a desperate fight for survival. As the floodwaters continued to ravage the region, the Kremlin's response was nothing short of predictable downplay, deflect, and distort. The truth of the catastrophe was growing too large to hide, but Russia's leadership, accustomed to controlling narratives, did what they could to obscure the reality. What had started as a subtle disruption had spiraled into a full-blown disaster, but the government's reaction was one of denial. There was no sense of urgency, no call to rally the nation in the face of disaster. Instead, there were empty assurances and half-truths that only fueled the growing frustration on the ground. Governor Vasily Gladov, whose job it was to manage the crisis on the local level, was forced to acknowledge the scale of the damage. For days, the authorities had attempted to keep the situation contained, hoping the flood's effects would subside quickly, that the problem would simply go away. But as the floodwaters continued to rise, the damage to the Belgod Reservoir Dam became undeniable. In a reluctant admission, Gladov confirmed that the dam had indeed been damaged by Ukrainian attacks. But that was all. There was no mention of the destruction of the supply lines, no recognition of the true cost of the damage, nor the humanitarian crisis that had unfolded in the wake of the flood. Instead, the focus shifted to damage control. The Kremlin's media machinery swung into action, attempting to shift the narrative. They worked tirelessly to cover up the military implications of the breach, glossing over the true scale of the flood's effects on Russian military operations. The real story, the story of thousands of Russian soldiers trapped without supplies, of entire brigades cut off from their command, of the logistical disaster unfolding at the front, was buried under a pile of carefully crafted half-truths. The authorities attempted to project control, presenting a narrative that downplayed the crisis, choosing to ignore the fact that their military's strategic backbone had been shattered by a force they couldn't control. The lack of transparency only worsened the situation. Civilians, already living under the strain of a prolonged war, found themselves caught in the middle of an escalating disaster. The government's failure to respond effectively created a vacuum of trust, with no real plan for evacuation, no clear answers on how to address the flood's devastation, and no tangible assistance coming from the authorities. Panic began to spread. The people, who had once trusted their leaders to provide security and stability, now felt abandoned. Their faith in the system began to crack. Every announcement from the Kremlin, every failed promise, only deepened the sense of isolation. In the midst of this crisis, one truth became painfully clear. The Kremlin's propaganda machine had its limits. For years, it had masked the failings of the government, built an image of strength and control, and kept the people in check with promises of power and victory. But in the face of nature's fury, all of that crumbled. The floodwaters, the rising panic, the suffering, it was all too much to hide, and the cracks in the government's control began to widen. In the space of just a few days, Russia's carefully constructed image of invincibility had been shattered. As the Kremlin scrambled to maintain control over the narrative, a different kind of resistance began to form. The truth, no matter how hard it was to suppress, was finding its way out. The people of Belgod and the affected regions were no longer willing to buy into the government's half-hearted reassurances. They saw the flood as more than just a natural disaster. They saw it as the direct result of a failure in leadership. The media, once a tool of state power, now became the conduit for dissent. The whispers of discontent began to spread, fueled by the government's inability to act, to protect, or to deliver on the promises that had once kept the nation's confidence intact. The Kremlin's effort to downplay the situation did little to quell the rising tide of frustration. As reports of the flood's impact reached the broader public, the people of Russia began to ask difficult questions. How could the government, so focused on military success, allow its own citizens to drown in the floodwaters? Why had there been no plan to protect them? Why were entire villages submerged without any meaningful response? The answers that the Kremlin provided were not enough to appease the growing anger. This was no longer just a matter of military strategy. It was a matter of survival, of trust, and of leadership. The very foundation of the Russian state was being tested, and it was becoming painfully obvious that it was not prepared for such a crisis. The failure to adequately respond to the flood, to provide support to those in need, was a failure of governance. It exposed the government's weaknesses, its inability to protect its people, and its lack of real solutions in times of genuine crisis. As the days dragged on and the floodwaters remained unchecked, the people's sense of abandonment grew. What had been an isolated incident, a failure of infrastructure and military strategy, had now become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the regime. The government's attempts to cover up the reality of the situation were falling on deaf ears. The Russian people were waking up to the truth. They had been left to fend for themselves, and their leaders had failed them when they needed them the most. The flood had not only stranded the Russian forces, it had effectively crippled them. The very foundation of their military operation had been torn apart, not by enemy fire, but by the relentless power of nature. The once unstoppable advance had come to a screeching halt. And now, with their supply lines severed, their units isolated, and their military logistics in complete disarray, the Russian forces faced the kind of paralysis that no enemy had ever inflicted upon them before. The Russian brigades, 4 of them, had been some of the most formidable units in their arsenal. The 128th, 116th, 68th, and 136th Motorized Infantry Brigades had been positioned strategically along the Severky Donets River, poised to push forward. They had been confident in their position, knowing that the bridges across the river, vital to their advance, would provide a steady flow of supplies and reinforcements. But now, those same bridges had been washed away, submerged beneath the rising waters. Their access to food, water, ammunition, and fuel had vanished, and with it, so had their ability to fight. In the face of this crisis, these brigades' once elite forces were now at the mercy of the flood. Trapped in a quagmire of mud and water, Their communication with command had been severed. The heavy vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces they depended on were now useless, bogged down by thick, waterlogged terrain. The soldiers who had once moved with purpose, fueled by supplies and coordination, now stood immobilized, staring at the rising water, helpless. The true extent of the catastrophe revealed itself as the days passed. The supply routes that had been the lifeblood of the operation were gone, and with them, the army's capacity to continue fighting. Alternative routes, if they even existed, were impassable for the heavy military trucks and armored vehicles. The flood had transformed the landscape into a hostile, impenetrable mess. What had once been a bustling front line was now a graveyard of vehicles, stuck in mud, with no way forward and no way back. Worse still, these forces weren't just isolated from their supply lines, they were now isolated from one another. The once organized battalion formations had fragmented into a scattered mess of stranded units, cut off by rising waters and unrelenting terrain. Their unity had been shattered. In such a state of confusion and disarray, the morale of the soldiers began to collapse. Those who had once been fearless in the face of the enemy now faced a much more terrifying foe, the overwhelming, inescapable flood. And it wasn't just the brigades in the flooded region that were affected. Even the reinforcements from other Russian divisions, including the 82nd Regiment and 138th Brigade, stationed in the occupied territories of Kiev Oblast, were cut off. The flood had not only trapped the soldiers at the front, it had isolated the entire operational command structure. From top to bottom, the Russian military machine had been thrown into chaos. The lines of communication that kept the forces coordinated and functioning had been severed, just like the bridges. For those trapped, the days stretched on in a maddening limbo. The Russian leadership, still reeling from the loss of their supply routes and failing to stem the damage, faced the painful truth. They could no longer rely on their traditional methods of warfare. The flood had done what no enemy missile or artillery strike could. It had rendered their army impotent, forcing them to watch as their own forces became casualties of an environmental disaster. The crisis deepened by the hour. As units began to realize the severity of their situation, their options became painfully clear. They were stranded, vulnerable, and completely isolated. They couldn't fight, they couldn't retreat, and with every passing day, the risk of starvation, dehydration, and disease grew. The conditions on the front were no longer a matter of tactics or strategy, they were a matter of survival. In these dire circumstances, the true test of the Russian military's resolve began. The leadership, scrambling for solutions, failed to act quickly enough. Meanwhile, soldiers, who had once trusted in the competence of their commanders and the power of their weaponry, were left to fend for themselves. The usual chains of command became blurred in the face of such overwhelming adversity. The harsh reality was setting in. The Russian military, once a symbol of strength, had been brought to its knees by the very environment they sought to conquer. With the supply lines destroyed, no reinforcements in sight, and their logistical operations shattered, Russian forces found themselves in the worst of all situations. They were caught in a trap, not made of steel and concrete, but of nature's unyielding force. And it wasn't just the soldiers at the front who were suffering. The political and military leadership in Moscow were beginning to realize the magnitude of the disaster. A disaster they couldn't hide or spin. The flood had exposed the frailties of the regime's military strategy, and there would be no easy way out. In the midst of this isolation, this logistical death trap, a single, undeniable truth began to form. Russia's military might was nothing in the face of nature's fury. The floodwaters had become their enemy, a force that no amount of artillery or airstrikes could defeat. And with it, the Russian dream of a swift, uncontested victory slipped further out of reach. Amid the crisis, as the floodwaters kept rising and every echo of hope seemed to fade away, an unavoidable truth emerged. The Russian government and military could not protect their own people. Not only the soldiers, but also the innocent civilians in the border regions. Those who had already endured the darkest days of war were now facing a survival catastrophe they could not control. This crisis was not merely a military failure, it was the failure of a system that had for too long relied on power, control, and hollow promises, while neglecting the most fundamental elements of life, humanity, and the protection of its citizens. When disaster struck, when everything fell apart, the greatest question facing the people in the affected areas was this: why were they left alone, without protection, without any promise fulfilled? In those desperate hours, as water poured into every street and every home, faith in the government was completely shaken. The authorities in Moscow could not respond in time, and their promises had become meaningless words. They failed not only in preventing the disaster, but also in protecting the people who had trusted them, who had placed their safety in their hands. Yet even amid the ruins, another kind of strength arose. It was the strength of humanity, of the people on the front lines, of the soldiers trapped in the flood, and of those who refused to lose hope. Though abandoned, though without any aid from their government, they kept fighting, not with weapons, not with military force, but with something far deeper, the will to survive and to protect those they loved. The soldiers trapped in the flooded zones, without weapons or supplies, still sought ways to survive. Their resilience became a source of strength for others. And while the army was completely cut off, the civilians in isolated villages, despite unimaginable hardship, came together to help one another through the darkest days. It was a living testament to the power of community, to the spirit of solidarity that needs no command from a weakened authority. And in those moments of struggle, a profound human truth was revealed. No government can replace humanity, and true power does not lie in military strategy or polished propaganda. It lies within the hearts of the people. When all else collapses, only faith in one another and the refusal to give up remain. The unity between civilians and soldiers, those still holding their ground at the front, became the real source of strength. This was not just a story of a military conflict. It was a story of compassion, of love, and of hope. While the failure of the Russian government and its army was undeniable, the courage and endurance of the abandoned people were unforgettable. They proved that even in the harshest conditions, humanity can rise again, finding strength within itself and within the bonds of community. When the final flood waters receded, only one truth remained. The downfall of power comes when it stops listening to and protecting those it is meant to serve. Yet it was also proof that no matter how merciless life may become, humanity, when bound by unity and love, will always be stronger than any disaster. And in the darkness of devastation, the light of courage and compassion will always lead the way. In the end, this was never just a story about war or strategy or the clash between nations. It was a story about human fragility and resilience. When the floodwaters rose, it wasn't only soldiers who were swept away, but the illusions of power, the pride of governments, and the belief that control could conquer chaos. Yet from that same devastation, we saw something that no weapon could destroy: the will to survive, to protect, to endure. Amid silence and ruin, humanity remained. The people who were abandoned didn't surrender. They carried each other through the rising waters, proving that courage does not belong only to armies. It belongs to every soul that refuses to give up when everything else is lost. The flood destroyed bridges, but it also revealed the invisible ones, the bridges of empathy, compassion, and unity that connect us all in our shared struggle for life. Perhaps that's what this story truly asks of us: to look beyond the politics, the flags, and the noise, and to remember what it means to be human. To understand that in every disaster, natural or man-made, the most powerful weapon we have is kindness.
Quickly now.
If this story moved you, share it. Let it remind others that no matter how great the storm, humanity's heart will always find a way to rise above the flood. Because in the end, the truest strength isn't in conquest, it's in compassion.